just a brief, again, review, sort of. We're here in this section where we're transitioning to discuss the priesthood. And that's what really 4 in verse 14 is laying out for us. It's since then we have a great high priest, etc., etc., etc. And that's really going to drive the thoughts all the way till chapter 10 and verse 25. So this is going to be the main kind of idea for that. And we'll see part of the sacrifice and covenant, but we're moving here into this next section. And so let's go ahead and read here, whoever would like to, chapter 4, verse 14. And go ahead and read down through chapter 5 and verse 13. As I mentioned, we may lightly touch on 11 through 13 just to kind of understand the conclusion as it relates to this section. And then we'll use most of that on Wednesday night. So whoever would like to read that for us. Okay.
Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters relating to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to one who could save him from death. He was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to make it clear to you, because you no longer try to understand. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. Did you say 3:14?
Yeah, go ahead and get the rest of the chapter.
You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil.
Okay, so let's talk about just the overall flow of this. As I mentioned, basically he's introducing this concept of the priesthood, and what we have here at the end of this is a bit of a, we need to take a sidetrack and explain like what really is the issue and what's the problem. And he mentions, and we're going to walk through the priesthood concept, but I want us to see the flow of thought here. Because down here in 11 down through verse 14, what was the primary issue that the church there was having?
Lack of maturity and understanding in their education about Scripture.
Yeah, and so there's a maturity element. There's a sense of responsibility of what they should be doing. He says in verse 12, by this time you ought to be teachers. And yet there's one primary idea. He says that this is hard to explain, but is it because the text is hard to understand?
Quit hearing.
Yeah, it's hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. Okay? Now the reason I want to bring that up is what was the main issue in the section we just talked about? What did Psalm 95 say? Well, and that's true, but it's because of the first thing. Well, it is unbelief, but it's the first thing. Today, if you will hear his voice, right? It is about the hearing that leads to belief, that leads to obedience, all those kinds of ideas. But it's about how they were not interested in hearing. And so again, he's going to kind of connect these concepts together. But so he's doing an explanation, talking about something, but they have to be willing to hear. Now, one thing I just want to mention, though, why do you think they're not interested in hearing this, though?
I'm in a position where following Jesus is inconvenient, and they hear what he has to say about Melchizedek, they're kind of being forced to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just inconvenience for them.
Yeah.
And danger on the part of the problem.
Sure. And have you ever become dull of hearing because you feel like you've heard something before?
Yep.
A lot of times that's the way it is. Anybody that has kids, right? You feel like you say the same thing over and over and over again, and what happens? They shut their ears, right? And so now, when we come to something like the priesthood, what do we want to do? Whatever, I don't care about priesthood, why does this really matter, right? But it's an important concept that the Old Testament has introduced and that they need to be really aware of. And it's kind of, I think for us, it's sort of a strange thing. So I want us to talk a little bit about that. So let's work through 4 verse 14 down through chapter 5 and verse 10. And let's talk about the observation here first. So what jumps out to you as you look at this section where he begins this discussion on priesthood?
Tie back to chapter 2.
Yeah.
2:17.
Yeah, 2:17. I also wrote chapter 3 and verse 1 because he mentions him being the high priest of our confession. So those, but all of that is definitely related.
Just starting with another warning as indicated by the words, let us.
Mm-hmm. Yep, good. What else?
I think it's also important to see here that Jesus is able to sympathize with us. I mean, if we look at our government who is supposed to be leading us, we look and go, you guys don't know what we're feeling at all. Whereas, and I'm talking from a South African point of view. But here we can see that Jesus, not just as the high priest, but he's able to sympathize with us. He's able to feel what we're feeling. He's able to know what we're feeling. Mm-hmm. And not just shout from the mountaintops, but don't understand what we're going through.
Yeah, and that's always like a contrast between good leadership and bad leadership, right? Is that distinction and the division between, oh, y'all go do all that, and I'm just going to stay here, which is totally the opposite with Jesus. Go ahead.
Okay. Going back to chapter 3, verse 6. And we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Then in verse 14 of chapter 3, for if we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end. Then verse 16 of chapter 4, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. They are in danger of losing their confidence because of their unwillingness to hear and their unbelief.
Right. And that's one thing I was going to ask in the interpretation section, but we can go ahead and talk about it here, is does this seem like a bit of a right turn based off of what we just talked about? We're talking about the land and the promises and all of that, and then, okay, let's go back to the priesthood. But it's based in this whole idea of the confidence and who's you're leading, what you're trusting in, what you're trying to accomplish. And so this is, again, tying back some, but as Byron has pointed out to us, it's all been who you're confessing in, holding fast to that, and that's going to be your means of victory. What were you going to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, just looking at that idea of weakness, one, you have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but then later on we do have the weakness talked about in the beginning of chapter 5. But that whole section there, weakness is not not an excuse in that sense, right? That is actually the method by which Jesus can be our high priest, is sympathizing with us in that sense. And that's already been, we talked about that in chapter 2, like what seems to be weakness, it's really Christ's power and strength. The same thing with us, that He enables us in our own weakness, dealing with sin and temptation. Because He was tempted in all things, He did not sin. There's that power.
Yeah, and the weakness, we got to be careful to, as we read this section, when he references weakness, he doesn't necessarily mean sinfulness, but he's talking about the weakness of the flesh, of needing to eat and drink and the suffering and all that kind of idea, because you'll notice here in chapter 5 and verse 7, he mentions in the days of his flesh, he's offering up prayer, supplication, loud cries. What's he referring to? That was Jesus' time of weakness. And that's going to be part of our sympathizing, how he sympathizes with us. Go ahead, Ed.
The discussion of the priesthood in the big picture is just part of a string of discussions of a systematic discussion of many elements of the Old Covenant, such as the priesthood, the law, the sacrifices, the tabernacle, all with the same intention to show that what we have in Christ is better than those old things.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we get into the interpretation concept, I want us to tease out the idea of priesthood because, as I mentioned, that it's just kind of weird for us, but we need to understand it in the Old Testament context to then better understand it with what we have now in Jesus. So, what else? What else jumps out to you as you look at this section? Yeah, that's good. That's one of the things we haven't talked about yet is about how priests are chosen and how they are put into their office. And you have there at the end of verse 4, God is the one that called Aaron, and then his appointment, then he goes on to talk about Jesus, that he didn't appoint himself, that it was an appointment made by God. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more, I'm sure. What else?
It would seem to me that in the old priesthood, the only kind of throne that we could imagine would be like the mercy seat, and the throne of grace is mentioned here, and drawing near. And in that same vein of confidence, it's much more tangible and approachable than it would have been in the old law and the process of sacrifice and the priest sitting on the mercy seat and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I see a contrast there that's able to build their confidence through a more accessible high priest and process of forgiveness of sins.
Yeah, so one thing that we'll probably emphasize more as we go forward is the contrast between heaven and earth throughout Hebrews. Is you have things that are happening on earth and things that are happening in heaven. And what you have then, and we'll see this in chapter 8, is the things that are on earth are shadows or copies of the heavenly. But as you enter into the earthly element, like there's a level of access, which is part of the priest concept. But again, all of that is just a shadow, because when Jesus actually ascends and goes into heaven, like we're talking about here, he's going into the real tabernacle, to the real temple, all of those kind of ideas. And so we'll see that as we go forward. I'll try to remind Nathan as we kind of go through to emphasize the heaven and earth theme as we work through it. What else? Anything else in this section? We're going to have plenty of application, I'm sure, at the end. But
still emphasizing sonship, even though he's transitioning into the priesthood, and he's going to have to flesh that out a little more in chapter 7, I guess, the basic elements are already here.
yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was at the end of 2 as well. And when we think about a son, we might think, oh, okay, I don't have to suffer, I don't have to go through things because I'm God's son, right? But his whole point here, look at verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience. So that's part of the whole father-son relationship. And then it's through what he suffered. And so we think, oh, I'm a child of God, I don't have to suffer. It's actually the exact opposite. Remember Remember, that's the process of our growing and maturing, and we'll talk about that as we go forward as well. All right, and go ahead.
And just going off that point
Sure.
too, I'm reminded of Hebrews 2 and verse 9 there. Because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, I count on Christ. Which that word honor has now come up a couple of times. So that chapter 3, talking about the one who's building the house, who has the honor there. Time of
Yeah.
Moses. Now here with Aaron, as this example, priest. No one takes the honor to himself. And even Christ doesn't glorify himself, but we're going to see where the honor comes in. I think that's such a everything else too.
Yeah, and it's the means, right? We'll talk about verse 9 about the being made perfect. This is kind of an interesting concept, but it's the means by which he is qualified to serve as our priest. And that's part of what's being discussed. Go ahead.
It seems like he's making a point to say in some way in 7 and 8 that Jesus not only got this just because he was already in with God or just because he came from God or something like that, but that his prayers, his loud cries were heard because of his reverence, not because he was special or given some deference that we aren't going to be given. And although he was a son, he learned obedience through suffering. So that kind of gives another layer, there's more dimension to this idea of how he, can empathize with us and truly went through everything as a man. Just gives more depth to that.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's saying that he's going to help us, but it's assuming that you're going to suffer, right? And so we got to kind of understand both of those. But again, this is not unusual. If you go back and you read Romans chapter 8, we're sons, we're fellow heirs, if we suffer with him. Like the same concepts are always there. It's just one of those things, and I think we've talked about this in the past. It's just easy in American culture with cultural Christianity to think, oh, it's more like health and wealth. Like, if I serve God, things are going to go well, relationships will be better. And yet the Scripture is usually the exact opposite of that. It is true, there's a lot of that that's true, but it's only one side of the equation. A lot of times it is through suffering, it's through putting to death our desires and that kind of thing, and those are definitely related. All right, well, I think we've observed the main ideas here, so let's talk about some of the means of interpretation here. And we've already talked about how this section connects back, so that was one of the things that I wanted to ask about. But let's talk about this sympathizing concept a little bit. Because how does Jesus sympathize with our weaknesses? Because you see it there in verse 15, but then you see in verse 2 and 3, he can deal gently, talking about the priesthood of Aaron, with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he's obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins. So there's kind of an idea there, and then we see it as well there in chapter 5 and verse 7. So how then is he able to sympathize with our weaknesses from this text?
Because he went through it.
Yeah. I know that seems really simple, but it's really profound, isn't it? I mean, do you ever feel like God is so mighty, he's so high, he's so other, right? That's the whole concept of holiness. It's like, how does he really understand what it's like to be me? And yet, that's really the foundation of this, is that yes, he is fully God, but he is also fully man, which is what we talked about there in chapter 2. Do y'all have any other kind of questions or thoughts related to that?
Well, if we believe that he was tempted in all ways as we are, we might not quite understand that because we weren't there with him. But we have to believe that he does understand the temptations that we go through, suffering we go through.
Yeah, and let's kind of piggyback on that for a second. When he says that he was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin, there in verse 15, he made a similar point at the end of 2. What does he mean by that? Does that mean that he had the internet in front of him? Does that mean that he had a car and he could have potentially ran people over or any of those kind of things? What does he mean by that? Go ahead.
It means that he was exposed to the types of problems that are common to men. It does not mean that he responded mentally or that he wanted those things. There's a song that we sometimes sing that says, "There is no voice that answers within." That's the way it was with Jesus. He was faced with the possibility of being tempted. There was something that might be considered desirable, but his mind was totally pure and did not respond at all to that.
Right. Go ahead.
This is one of those Bible concepts to me that we can think about, read, and understand the words, but we can't ever fully grasp exactly what it means. We have to take it on a certain amount of faith because it's what it says. I don't understand totally what it means when somebody's tempted but not really tempted.
Right.
And that's what we're saying. And that's true because that's what this says. He never sinned. He was not tempted in the respect of wanting to sin like we might be. But as Ed said, he faced those things, so he has an understanding. You might think, well, how can he understand it if he wasn't really tempted?
Right.
I don't know. But I know that this says he understands. I know it says he intercedes for us because he has faced those things. And you just have to accept that.
Well, and that's one of the things we mentioned in 2 Corinthians, is that really, at the heart of pretty much every truth in Scripture, there is an inexplicable paradox. And there's a reason for that. It's because now you're coming in contact with something that's beyond you. And that's part of this idea. So go ahead, Joel. Hold on, sorry, Joel was first.
Well, so I think part of that too is there's a difference between suffering and having evil desires. And I think that's sort of one place where we can understand that he suffered immensely and greatly desired not to suffer, but that didn't mean there was evil desire there. I think another point from this just really quickly is contrasting Jesus with Saul and Uriah from the Old Testament, both of whom ended up trying to function as priests at different points during their reign. They did that trying to take power to themselves, and they did that without going through any of the necessary prerequisites to taking the priesthood on.
Yeah.
And specifically, this idea of not suffering or not being able to, or suffering or being able to relate to the people. And so God's looking at Jesus and he's putting his own son on the throne, he's putting his own son as high priest, and that could look for all the world like nepotism until you realize what God required of him to take those positions.
Sure.
And he wasn't going to let him get away with anything. And Jesus didn't want to. He wanted to go through that.
Yeah, a way that you could actually trace the Bible story is by following priesthoods all the way through with what Noah does, what Adam does, but then also what you brought up is of people trying to usurp and go into God's presence without him being authorized. Just think about what Jeroboam did. He's like, hey, the priesthood's open to everybody, come on down, right? At the end of Judges, it's the same idea. It's this upside down of, hey, I can just waltz into God's presence. It doesn't matter that he called. I can do this however I want to do this. And it's never been that way. Go ahead, Byron. What were you going to say?
So I would say, we're told in James that we're only drawn away by things that actually are a temptation, or what might be a desire to us. Think about Jesus' temptation. They were given to him after 40 days of not eating or drinking, and having been to the wilderness. That was pretty significant. So he would have been at a weak point. So the first thing is use your power to overcome your suffering by turning stones into bread. Right. You don't have to feed yourself. God gave you the power to just do it. The second one was, let's just short circuit all this teaching and preaching and go through this trying to convince the people. Just throw yourself off the pinnacle of the temple and everybody will see who you are. And he didn't do it. And the third was that he was going to be given authority over all things. And the devil tempted short-circuit that.
Yeah.
So, I've got to believe that the reason the devil hit him with those things, because what he was trying to do is to get Christ to take it without suffering.
Right.
And so, I think we need to keep that in mind here. I don't know what Jesus would have been tempted by, maybe nothing, but I have to believe there was at least enough temptation there for him to understand our weakness.
Right, yeah, and really, we need to look at temptation in kind of a bigger perspective. Almost always, it's a good desire that we want a shortcut. Whether it's marriage, whether it's money, whether it's a job, like it's something that God wants to give to us, but it has to be done through a particular means. Now, when you go through that means, what do you have to do? You have to suffer. You have to endure. You've got to say, okay, I can't have this right now. I have to go through God's means to actually receive that. And sometimes that's on a greater scale than just, okay, I have to, show up at a certain time to receive a certain job or whatever. So it's a little more complicated, but go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Byron's point on that. I think, we got to remember that it is not sinful to be tempted. It does not impute any sin on Jesus for him to have been mentally tempted by these things. We even see that come out in his prayer in the garden, and that he was at least able to conceptualize a desire that was contrary to the Father's will. He said, "Let this cup pass from me." He asked for that to be the case. There was human desire for a path other than what what the Father's will was. But that highlights just how amazing it is what he did and how he can sympathize with us, in that he submitted his will to the Father's and changed his will to be the Father's.
Yeah, and again, that's the model, right? Is that it may be something that in of itself is not wrong, but we have to realize God has a bigger plan. God has a greater goal, that even me getting something that in of itself is, safety or whatever, in this moment actually is wrong, because it's not according to his will. There's something greater. So let's talk about this priesthood concept for just a second, because again, like I mentioned, this kind of seems a little strange to us, but why is the priesthood idea so essential? Why is he going to spend, just chapters and chapters talking about this idea?
Our hope is tied to his being a mediator.
Okay.
And that's what a high priest is a mediator.
Yeah. But for us, how many people feel like they need a mediator to survive? That's not a normal thing unless you're in prison or something like that, and you're under a death sentence. You need someone to be an intermediary, right? You need someone to go on your behalf. So there's that kind of element. But what else is involved in a priest? Why do you need it? Why do you need it?
What you just described is an American problem. We don't need it because we have it.
Right.
If you put yourself into Africa or into dictatorships in South America or over in China, you wish you had somebody who could make things right. You realize you can't do it. You need somebody that has more power than you do. That was the high priest. Only the high priest could go before God with your sin and have that removed. Only Jesus can remove that fully with his own blood. And so the concept you just described is a American problem.
Yeah.
We don't feel like we need it. That's real dangerous for us.
Yeah.
We really do need Jesus.
Yeah, it's the Jeroboam mentality. Hey, we can go to God. Anybody can go to God. We just waltz on in there. And that's never been the idea, all the way back from the garden. What were you going to say?
That
Okay. What else? So again, and here then is the other element that's right here in verses 5 and 6, and that he's talking about in verse 4, is that when you have any kind of priesthood, God makes the decision about who comes before him. We don't just go through and say, hey, I'll worship God however I want to. I'll do this my way. I can just kind of, organize and structure things however I want. No, God has to do this. And notice in verse 5, Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed. If he would have tried to exalt himself, that's the fundamental flaw. That's the fundamental issue all the way back from the garden, all the way through humanity, is thinking, I'm going to do this my way instead of God's way. I'm greater and better than him. And that becomes the essential nature of a high priest. And so then, at least I think the Jews would understand that. And I think to a certain extent the pagans would. But again, like for us, we're just kind of, we just don't fully grasp this concept. But it was absolutely essential in their time, and Jesus needed because of that. But what other questions do you have from this text?
Shane, maybe not a question, more of a comment about the high priest, is that it's this form of leadership that is required. And when I got into business, one of the lessons that I learned very early on in age is that when you don't have a leader, everybody's head is up, trying to see what everybody else is doing, because nobody wants to do more than the other person, because then it's unfair. But when you've got a leader, the leader holds their head up and they overlook the flock and make sure that everybody is doing their part. And I look at Jesus with the apostles, and I think that Jesus did that with his apostles as well. He was able to extract himself, make sure they were doing the work that needed to be done, instead of everybody trying to be the leader or everybody trying to see what everybody else is doing and not getting the work done.
Yeah. And it's interesting, going through Mark, what you have is when they take their eyes off of Jesus and following Jesus, they start arguing with each other. They're like, who's greater? Who's better at this? And, it's like, hold on a second. Like, you kind of missed the entire concept there. I do want to ask you about this text, though, verse 9. How can someone who is perfect be made perfect?
I don't think it's.
I know, I worded it a certain way, and it's kind of the skeptic idea, but what does he mean by how Jesus was made perfect and became the source, this again goes back to chapter 2, of eternal salvation to all who obey him?
The only way to explain it is the completeness of something that you start out with a project, and you know when it's complete. God started out with a project, and only when he completed that project was it called perfect. So Jesus was perfected when he suffered and when he died. And then God's plan was complete.
Yeah, and that's the idea in the context, right? Is that because he's gone through this, he's qualified to serve in this position. There's a specific context within that. Go ahead.
So you have Jesus come to earth with this purpose and with this mission, but when he comes to earth, he is not yet the high priest. He is not yet what he will be. Just in this, and the important thing I think is it's the same way with us, and he's showing us through this that it is the same way with us. Yeah, we are made with this perfect purpose. We were even made in a perfect way, but we have to be perfected, and it's the same way as Jesus was. It's through suffering.
Yeah, and we'll definitely come to the applications of that here in a second. But one of the best illustrations I've ever heard of this was actually referring to a plant. So if you put a seed in the ground, and then it goes through this entire process here. Again, it's kind of a flawed illustration, but is there any time where the plant itself is imperfect? Whenever it's a seed, whenever it's growing, and all of that. At every single stage, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do at that moment. It's not sinning, it's not flawed in some way, but there is a process of growth through that. And that's what he's describing here. It's not that Jesus failed to be God or failed in some sinful way. It's that there was a mission, there was a goal that he was moving through and was completed every single stage through that until he bore fruit. And that's the whole idea. Okay, well, there's a lot that we've worked through here, But the whole point of this is really about application. Because that's, as Ed started out here at the beginning of this is a call to behave different and to act different based off of what we've already kind of worked through and understood. So we've got about 7-8 minutes or so. Let's talk through the applications of this text, because there's plenty here. So what jumps out to you on how you can use this in your practical, like when you leave today? I mean, there's a lot here. So what jumps out to you? Go ahead.
So looking at especially verses 14 through 16, we see that sin is not an inherent part of the human condition. Otherwise, logically speaking, Jesus couldn't sympathize with us because he didn't sin. And so going through that, this is a reminder for us, just like we may be beset with weakness too, like through the flesh, but also faced with temptation. That doesn't mean to give in to them. That's just a reminder for us again that like that wasn't God's intention. That was not God's plan for man to sin. And it might seem like a simple point, but we need that constant reminder when we're faced with that temptation. Need for endurance and need to go through suffering.
Yeah, and I think as I think about that concept, what works through my mind is that oftentimes the temptation is you need to commit this sin to be more human. When in fact the idea of the sin is to make you less human, less like God, less made in His image, and destroys that. And so that's part of this whole mentality. Go ahead.
So another thing that may not seem intuitive, but I think the author is making a point of, he's talking about confidence and not losing it. But when we are tempted to lose it, where should we go? To the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace and help in time of need. The idea being, I think, exactly what was presented us in the gospel. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Right? We can go to Him because He understands.
Yeah.
He will help us.
Yeah, and when we think about confidence, I think it's easy to kind of get lost in the idea. The confidence is not in our merit. It's our confidence in Him as our high priest. That He listens to us, not because we're so great, but because He's so great. Go ahead.
Well, that's the old law. These people recognize that they sin and they have to take a gift to the priest in order to get to God, to have that sin forgotten for now.
Yeah.
And that's the way we are. If I sin, then I have to realize I have sinned, and I have great confidence. He will forgive me once I get to that gift to Him.
Yeah, and that's the interesting contrast through this. Because if they reject Jesus and go back to Judaism, you're saying, I'm going to appeal through Aaron. I'm going to appeal through that line. And that's his whole point, and we'll see this more when we get to chapter 7. One is so much better than the other. Why would you go with Aaron, the one that made the golden calf and said, hey, this is our gods that brought us up from Egypt? You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's your past priesthood that you're wanting to appeal on compared to the one that is tempted at all points like as you are, yet without sin. And they can now truly offer himself for you. Go ahead.
I'll also say that given when this was written and what they might have seen, that how would you have liked to go to Caiaphas or Annas for your...
Yeah, there's your high priest for you.
Yeah, that essentially, yeah, I want to go to them because they'll understand. And they'll help. They won't.
Yeah, are they going to give you mercy and grace to help you in your time of need? They sure didn't do it to Jesus, and they're not going to do it for you either. What else? What other applications? Go ahead, Ed.
Byron mentioned 16. I would just say that to me that's the core of the whole thing. It really ties together the warning and the discussion of the high priest. Starting in verse 14, he said, since this is true, since we have so great a high priest, then we can have confidence, then we can find grace and mercy.
Right.
So that's almost a summary sentence for the whole section.
Yeah, because if you don't have him, none of the other stuff works. He's the power generator. Go ahead.
We can get, looking back at the Exodus picture and the picture on Mount Sinai, and just all through the Old Testament especially, when you see what happens when people try to approach the presence of God and just what that looks like,
Yeah.
and over and over again, God tells Moses, warn the people, don't let the people come up, don't let their animals get close to the mountain. All of these safeguards in place so that they don't come in my presence because they're going to die. And that is the picture of what we can now go to confidently, and not in order to get zapped, but rather we have this even greater thing now that we can approach directly, and we're approaching it not in fear. And that's just profound. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, even during that time, that same priesthood, the rebellion of Korah, is this same idea. I want to do it my way. The whole budding of Aaron's rod. What does that mean? Who gets to go to God on our behalf? It's the same kind of pictures replaced over and over. Now, I want to talk about this concept in verses 8, 9, and 10 a little bit. When he talks about that he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. What does he mean? What is he referring to when he says he's the author of eternal salvation to everyone who obeys him? Like, what does obedience look like in this section? I think a lot of times this verse is like kind of pulled out of its context. Like, hey, you got to obey God to be saved. I mean, there's a part of that that's true, but contextually it has something else in mind. Or there's more to that in mind. What does the obedience look like?
Well, I think that what he's getting at is he quotes Psalm 2, "You are my son, that got you," which Paul said was when he was raised, the begetting was when Jesus was raised from the dead. So the idea being that Jesus had to put his faith and trust in God during that suffering, that if he died, and he would die, that God would not allow his soul to see corruption. So when he did that, he became our perfect Savior, because he did exactly what we have to do.
Yeah,
Right?
and I'll insert one little thing as a little explanation note. It is suffering to the point of death. That's what obedience in this context is. He suffered till the point of death, and that's why he's rewarded. If you want more evidence about this, just look at Philippians 2. Why is he exalted? Because he humbled himself even to the point of death. And that's the message that is here encapsulated in the book of Hebrews. Now, the last one I want to ask you about is about prayer. Prayer is all through this, and he says that he prayed loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him, and he was heard because of his reverence. How was he heard? I mean, he prayed to not go through it. How was he heard? It was raised from the dead. You see the answer? It was not, hey, deliver me, and then he didn't have to face the cross. It was, I will save you on the other side of the cross. You die, you're buried, you're raised. And that's so critical for what the Hebrews have to understand about the gospel. Your salvation is not right here in this moment from your suffering. It is through death, through burial, and through the resurrection that God will answer those prayers. Okay, I think we made it. Let's stop right there. We'll pick up on Wednesday at verse 11 and continue on down into chapter 6.